The Bracebridge Seed Exchange serves as a guide or template to the building or organizing of a conservative community. This statement needs explaining. Conservatism is contrasted with socialism or liberalism. These are opposite paradigms, each with its unique economic and business model. Ultra-conservative communities possess both sustainability and resilience. But let me explain. To be conservative is to be bullish economically. Conservatives tend towards sounder economic policy, at least from a conservative standpoint, and they think in terms of long-term strategies. Conservatives also favor cash spending and greater liquidity. Conservative economics favor delaying gratification and taking a slow and steady approach to things, avoiding debt and risky jumps without a well-established exit strategy. Economic liberals are more lavish and focused on immediate gratification. There's a tension between these two economic models. Ultra-conservatism is an attempt to divest our social model, of all liberal contaminations and inclinations and build solidly on an economic conservative foundation, which we think gives us the best results. So what this discussion attempts to do is to demonstrate that sustainable communities are possible and that they are inherently conservative. Food chains are the highest priority when discussing sustainability and resilience. Housing is important, but necessarily a local matter. Whatever failings exist in our housing programs, it has little to do with external threats. Food is another matter. Bracebridge, being in Canada, must adapt to a short growing season. However, it is short-sighted to allow climate to dictate the length of our supply chains. If COVID-19 taught Canadians anything, it is that it is risky to assume things will remain the same. The problems we and other nations had with personal protective equipment drove home the inadvisability of becoming dependent on foreign suppliers of vital goods and services. PPE were not that difficult to produce once we decided it had to be done. Food shortages, however, are not so easily rectified. Whether due to supply chain issues or external factors such as riots or pandemics, replacement of foodstuffs is not as simple as producing face masks. We cannot convert a factory to the production of fruits and vegetables, at least not overnight. However, this fact is not the same thing as saying it could not be done and ought not to be done as a longer-term strategy. The issue of cost will undoubtedly rise. Are local crops competitive with imports? Is an obvious question. The question can only be answered after we decide what the cost of exposure to long supply chains is. Do you prefer to pay $200 a week for food bought locally? Or do you prefer $100 a week for food bought from overseas suppliers and $30 a week to subsidize unemployed farmers, $30 a week in transportation and pollution costs developed by the longer supply chains, and $30 in taxes to supplement the taxes not paid by local processors hurt by importing substitutes for the local option? It's a matter of choices and what we are willing to pay for, in other words. Even if the local option costs more in real terms, the comparison of cost is meaningless. If we want local food security, we pay the price. Comparing the price of options is even more difficult if all of the real and secondary costs are not and cannot be factored into the price we pay for the import or the final product. Some years ago, China was accused of putting melamine into milk powder. How often does food get contaminated with bacteria of human excrement by large producers of food products? There are costs to every choice. You have to decide what a product or service is worth. We have to decide what we want and what we are willing to pay for. It's all choices. Bracebridge has land, and we have people. What more do we need? If we need more people and more land to produce what we want, let's look closer to home for it rather than further afield. There is one other thing needed beside land and people. Some say we need willpower to get things done. Willpower is determination expressed by one person. This is important, but willpower is most effective when expressed in the context of a conservative community. For willpower to bear fruit, it needs a solid platform on which to work. The platform is called ownership. Conservative communities are privately owned places. We own where we live, or ought to. Buying foodstuffs outside of Bracebridge shifts power to an alien place. The justification for doing this is the amount of benefit it brings to the buyer. Ultra-conservative communities turn the community into a brokerage so that buying and selling decisions are made in a wider context. It either pays to import a product or not. Without accounting for the costs and benefits of a choice, how do we know which choice to make? What needs to be considered is if the purchase benefits a single person, is it profitable for that one person or business? Or does it benefit the community as a whole? Who ought we to trust to calculate the net benefits or loss of a transaction? We could contract the buying to Walmart, independent grocers, the provincial or federal governments, and various other well-placed individuals. However, it is the citizen who pays the ultimate price. Citizens, then, ought to be the ones who are keeping the books, who are setting the value of things and calculating the profit and loss of the community choices. Think of an island owned by Joe. Joe is very rich. He invites us to his island. The island has one store from which we buy what we need. Joe's store gives us an allowance or store credit. Some might say we are free persons, freer indeed than many. However, subjects have only the freedom they are given. The freedom subjects have is the freedom farm animals have. Joe asks us to work 23 hours a week on community projects. Every person is paid the same allowance per week. The only penalty the island has for criminal or antisocial behavior is ejection from the island. Unemployment and inflation in taxes and crime would be, in this case, zero or close to it. Banks and public servants would not be needed, because we are all paid the same rate. Those who are good at something would naturally gravitate to that, and few would complain, because the objective would be to get the assigned job done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. This is not a description of an ideal community. Joe has absolute power. He's an autocrat. Are the people on the island free or not, though? Do they have power? Are they oppressed? This mental exercise helps us to understand conventional thinking about economic freedom is not that helpful. Workers in liberal democracies have little economic power. However, business persons have little economic power when compared to their silent partner, the liberal state. Power is ownership. What we own, we have power over. The power we have is tied to the amount of ownership, not just the quantity of things owned, but the quality of the ownership. The only way to abdicate a position of power is to abdicate ownership. To be food secure is to own our food sources. It is not sufficient to have access to food. We need to own the supply chain itself. We need to have power over it. The easiest way to gain food security is to shorten the supply chain until the source of our supplies are within the confines of Bracebridge. However, pragmatic considerations will extend our buying into Muskoka, Simcoe, and Ontario, and even beyond. The intent ought to be to shorten the supply chain and permit it to stretch further only when the risks are fully understood and accounted for. The further the source, the less crucial is the supply, and the greater the distance the product travels, the more that is saved or ought to be saved through the use of the distant market. We can tolerate 5,000-kilometer long supply chains if we are talking about sneakers. It is less advisable to permit similarly long supply chains for heart medications, for example. Conservatives are not just those people who attempt to tone down the progressive rhetoric of liberals or caution them about increasing debt levels. Conservative communities look to conserve what we have. This is a two-edged sword because we cannot allow things to remain idle, nor can we use them carelessly. This dilemma gives us a sense of purpose because it tells us we must be useful. We cannot stand idle, but in a specific targeted way defined by the possibilities of our situation. More importantly, this level of usefulness must be validated in a quantified way. It is for this reason the conservative community has the structure of a brokerage. Every conservative or citizen is entitled to a common share in the conservative community brokerage. An ultra-conservative community assumes the form of a brokerage in which each citizen owns a common share. Brokerages buy and sell on behalf of its clients. In this case, these clients are the citizens of Bracebridge. The brokerage gives buyers and sellers security and removes risks from the transactions they participate in. As sellers to the exchange, clients produce things of value. Value is expressed in the exchange as equity. Equity is value added to an asset. The earth we plant in and the seeds planted are assets of Bracebridge. Planting and growing seeds adds value to the Bracebridge brokerage. Reaping and processing adds further value to the crop. Purchasing product from the brokerage or brokers transforms the equity of the buyer into new assets for the seller. The brokerage serves as an underwriter and guarantor for the buyer and seller. By going through a brokerage, risk is liquidated or eliminated for the participants in the transaction. Conservatives use the equity issued by the brokerage as a medium of exchange. The brokerage business represents the equity created by broker members. The equity created by growing crops or processing the crop can be turned into a currency. Equity in the brokerage is issued as preferred shares. These shares are issued in the same denominations as the domestic currency, and it replaces fiat and bank money for the local purchases. Prefers, which is a contraction of preferred shares, refers to the medium of exchange used by the brokerage. The person who creates $500 worth of value for the brokerage is paid or credited with 500 units of preferred shares. Prefers are used by the client then to purchase 500 units worth of products from the exchange, from the brokerage. The brokerage is composed of small groups. Each group is composed of around 12 to 15 persons. Each group or cell appoints a chairperson. The medium of exchange is designed by the brokerage to be used as a medium of exchange between members of the brokerage. As the goods and services made available by members expands and increases, the exchange structure will also become more complex. To form the brokerage, clients come together to specialize. Each grower grows two or three crops. Reaping and processing is performed by clients, as is the selling and other tasks. Each person is paid for the value they create for the exchange by the exchange or according to a predetermined schedule. All product is paid for using prefers. Prefers are issued as credits to the account of the client. Purchasers are debited from client accounts. The brokerage maintains a ledger in which these accounts are maintained. Each group seeks to specialize. Similar occupations group in the same exchange. As groups diversify and specialize, new exchange units are created. The ultra-conservative community is identified with the brokerage and the use of a currency backed by and issued as preferred shares.